It all started off pretty well. Life was steady, predictable, and honestly, pretty comfortable. My wife had been at the same job for a few years, and while she didn't exactly love it, she made it work. We had our routines, early mornings together, sipping coffee before she headed off to the office, and quiet evenings where we'd share dinner and she'd sometimes unload about her day. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a good rhythm. At least, that's what I thought. But as time went on, little things began to change. She started coming home more on edge, and her usual venting about work took on a sharper tone. It wasn't just about the workload or the standard office politics anymore. Her frustration zeroed in on one person, a colleague she described as utterly insufferable. This woman, according to my wife, always had something to say, a comment, a snide remark, or some passive-aggressive way of cutting her down during meetings. I'd never met the woman, but from what I heard, she was a real thorn in my wife's side. One evening, though, my wife came home in a way I hadn't seen before. She was pacing the living room, muttering under her breath, clearly upset. When I asked if everything was okay, she just shook her head, repeating that she couldn't take it anymore. Apparently, this colleague had said or done something that crossed a line for her that day. I tried to calm her down, told her to take a breath and think things through, but she wasn't in the mood to hear it. The next morning, she was still simmering. She barely touched her breakfast, and I could see her mind racing, playing out arguments or scenarios before she even stepped out the door. As she grabbed her bag, she muttered, "I might just quit today." I didn't think much of it. I mean, people say that all the time when they're mad. But that afternoon, when she came back home earlier than usual, work bag in hand and a certain look in her eyes, I knew she'd followed through. She sat me down and told me how she'd walked straight into her manager's office, handed over her resignation, and left without a second glance. There hadn't been any planning, no backup job, no strategy. She'd acted purely on instinct. As she described the moment, her face lit up. She said she felt lighter, like she'd finally shaken off a weight she'd been carrying for too long. She wasn't going to let that toxic place drag her down anymore. That evening, as we sat at the table, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time. She looked genuinely relieved. I felt torn. On one hand, I admired her for standing up for herself, for having the guts to walk away from something that made her so unhappy. But on the other hand, the practical side of me couldn't ignore the bigger picture, the mortgage, the bills, all the responsibilities that didn't disappear just because she quit. In the days that followed, she seemed different, lighter, freer somehow, but there were also these moments of doubt. I'd catch her staring at her laptop, scrolling through job listings with a worried expression. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was questioning if she'd made the right move. Determined to bounce back, my wife dove into the job hunt like it was a full-time job in itself. She spent hours glued to her laptop, scouring job boards and sending out applications. The problem was, her field was so specialized that openings were few and far between. And she was stubborn. She flat out refused to consider anything outside her expertise, no matter how much I gently suggested a temporary job to tide us over. She was focused on finding the right fit and wasn't willing to compromise. At one point, she reached out to a close friend, someone she'd always trusted for advice. They met for coffee one afternoon, and when she came back, she was practically glowing. Her friend had a connection, a guy who could help her land a job in her exact field. She explained this wasn't some vague promise but a real opportunity. This guy wasn't a recruiter or anything, just someone with the right connections to put in a good word for her. She was so full of optimism about the opportunity that I didn't have the heart to voice my skepticism. Still, there was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right with me. I suggested that I come along to the meeting, not because I didn't trust her, but because I wanted to get a sense of who this guy really was. To my surprise, she didn't hesitate for a second before agreeing. The meeting was scheduled for a quiet Saturday afternoon at a cozy little cafe downtown. We got there a few minutes early, and I scanned the room as we waited. When he finally arrived, I couldn't help but take note of how polished he looked. He was well-dressed, carried himself with a confident air, and, honestly, came across as a little too smooth for my liking. From the moment he sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that his focus was locked on my wife more than it needed to be. He spoke directly to her, peppering their conversation with compliments, her intelligence, her professionalism, even her appearance. She nodded politely, though every now and then, she'd glance in my direction as if checking to see how I was reacting. He claimed to know someone in her exact field who was looking to hire, and he definitely sounded knowledgeable. But the way he leaned in a little closer every time she spoke made me feel uneasy. At one point, I jumped in with a few questions of my own, trying to gauge how legitimate his connections really were. He answered smoothly, with just enough detail to seem credible, but something about him still rubbed me the wrong way. My wife, on the other hand, seemed cautiously hopeful. After about an hour, the guy said he needed some time to reach out to his contacts and promised to follow up soon. She thanked him warmly, and we headed out. As we walked back to the car, she was practically glowing. She went on about how encouraging the meeting had been and how this could be the break she'd been waiting for. I kept quiet, not wanting to dampen her excitement, but that unease in my gut wouldn't go away. A week and a half later, she came home with big news: she'd officially been offered the job. Her face lit up as she rattled off details about the salary, the responsibilities, and how everything finally seemed to be falling into place. She'd start in just over a week, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was genuinely excited. I tried to share in her happiness, but that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't let me fully relax. Something didn't feel right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Not long after she started the job, little things around the house began to feel off. At first, it was subtle, so subtle I thought I might have been imagining it. I'd come home from work and feel like the house had been disturbed somehow. The carpet near the front door would have faint traces of dirt, or items on the kitchen counter weren't quite where we'd left them in the morning. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but the unease kept growing. Then one evening, I noticed our wedding photo, the one we kept framed on the hallway shelf, was lying face down. When I asked her about it, she said she must have knocked it over while cleaning, but her explanation felt hollow, like she wasn't really thinking about what she was saying. On top of that, she'd grown distant, distracted. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd wave it off, saying she was just stressed about the new job or trying to mentally prepare herself for her responsibilities. I wanted to believe her, but something about her demeanor didn't feel right. Her phone became another sticking point. She started guarding it more carefully than usual, always keeping it face down on the table or carrying it with her from room to room. If I walked into the room while she was using it, she'd quickly lock the screen or turn it over. I asked her about it once, as casually as I could manage. She brushed it off, saying she'd just been chatting with her friend about work, but her tone made it clear she didn't want to discuss it further. One night, long after she had drifted off to sleep, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. Quietly, I reached for her phone on the nightstand and unlocked it. My hands were steady, my breathing even. I wasn't nervous, I was determined, focused. At first, everything seemed normal. There were the usual work emails, group chats, and texts with her friend. But then I stumbled upon the conversation with him, the guy from the meeting. At first glance, it looked professional enough, with talk about her new role, job expectations, and her first day. But as I scrolled further up, the tone shifted in a way that made my stomach turn. He wasn't just talking about her job anymore. He was talking about them. About how he knew she was married but didn't care. About how they could meet at our house while I was at work. He even referred to it as his thing, his preference. He promised her a lucrative, high-paying position as long as she went along with it. I kept scrolling, reading every word, my chest tightening with every sentence. There was no mistaking what had happened. she'd agreed to it. Maybe she was too blinded by her obsession with getting this job, or maybe she'd convinced herself it wasn't a big deal. Whatever her reasoning, it didn't matter. The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. I carefully placed her phone back exactly where it had been and walked out to the living room. I didn't wake her. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I sat there, staring into the darkness, and began to plan. I wasn't going to lash out in anger or cause a scene. That would be too simple, too predictable. No, I wanted something calculated, deliberate. I wanted to dismantle whatever fantasy they thought they were living, piece by piece. As an engineer and a skilled technician, I'd spent my life understanding systems, how they worked, and more importantly, how to manipulate them to my advantage. This was no different. If I was going to confront what was happening in my own home, I had to be methodical, invisible. The first step was setting up surveillance. I installed small, discrete cameras in key areas of the house, the living room, the hallway, and yes, even the bedroom. These weren't your standard motion-activated cameras, they streamed live to a secure server I'd set up on one of my old laptops. I made sure to place them where no one would think to look, double-checking every angle to ensure nothing would escape my notice. But cameras alone weren't enough. I needed more, ways to disrupt their plans subtly, without tipping my hand. So, I started crafting little accidents around the house. I loosened a floorboard in the hallway so it would creak loudly under even the softest step. I adjusted the bedroom door hinge so it closed slower than usual, making it impossible to shut quietly. These weren't obvious changes, just small tweaks designed to create doubt. Next, I rigged the bedroom lights with a timer connected to my phone. At random intervals, the lights would flicker or shut off entirely for a few seconds. To an unsuspecting pair, it would seem like harmless electrical issues. But combined with everything else, it would create an underlying sense of unease. I didn't stop there. I tampered with the thermostat so that the temperature would suddenly drop without warning, only to return to normal minutes later. I wanted them to feel a chill, literally and figuratively. In the living room, I ensured the TV remote would occasionally act up, changing channels on its own or responding sluggishly. I knew they'd spend time there, and even minor glitches could make them question whether they were truly alone. Then, for an extra layer of psychological pressure, I began moving small personal items ever so slightly each day. A framed photo on the shelf shifted 2 inches to the left. A coaster on the coffee table turned at a different angle. They were such subtle changes that someone paranoid enough would start second-guessing their own memory. These were all small, seemingly innocuous details, but together, they would build into something larger. I wanted to let them feel comfortable, like they had control, while planting seeds of doubt in their minds. For now, I stayed silent. But step by step, move by move, I was laying the groundwork. They wouldn't see it coming. Of course, I made sure that none of my tricks could be traced back to me. Every adjustment, every glitch was subtle enough to pass as coincidence, a streak of bad luck or random malfunctions piling up around them. Nothing overt, nothing obvious. While they were busy second-guessing reality, I was quietly watching, recording, waiting. This wasn't about confrontation. Not yet. It was about control. About making them feel like something wasn't quite right but leaving them unable to pinpoint why. And now, as I sit here ready to share what I had planned next, I can't help but feel a certain satisfaction. They had no idea what was coming. The first trap I set was simple but effective. Above our bed, we had a small decorative shelf where a few books sat, including an old family Bible. I'd modified the bracket holding the shelf in place, installing a small release mechanism I could trigger remotely. It wasn't dangerous, just symbolic, almost poetic. If someone was lying in the bed just right and I pressed the button, gravity would do the rest. Before putting my plan into action, I arranged to take some time off work. I didn't tell my wife, of course. As far as she knew, I was still heading out every morning and coming home like clockwork. But instead of going to work, I spent my days carefully preparing and waiting. On the day I'd been anticipating, I parked my car a few blocks away and crept into the backyard, hiding behind a thick patch of bushes. From there, I had a clear view of my surveillance tablet, which streamed live feeds from the hidden cameras in the house. Right on schedule, an expensive, sleek car pulled up in front of the house. I watched as he stepped out, every bit as smug and self-assured as I remembered. His suit was sharp, his demeanor confident, far too polished for someone who was supposedly just a professional contact. My wife greeted him at the door, her smile a little too wide, and they walked inside together. My jaw clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm and focused. Through the bedroom camera, I watched as they perched on the edge of the bed, talking and laughing softly. It didn't take long for the tone to shift. He leaned in closer, and she didn't pull away. Soon, they moved onto the bed, their conversation becoming more intimate. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I didn't let anger cloud my judgment. I waited. My finger hovered over the button controlling the shelf mechanism. Timing was everything. And then, at the perfect moment, I pressed it. The release clicked, the bracket shifted, and the shelf gave way. The heavy Bible fell with a satisfying thud, landing squarely on his face. The impact wasn't enough to seriously hurt him, but it definitely got his attention. He yelped, clutching his nose as he rolled off the bed in shock. The mood shattered instantly. My wife gasped, scrambling to check on him, but the damage was done. They spent the next half hour in awkward silence, her handing him tissues while they avoided eye contact. Eventually, he muttered some excuse about needing to leave and made his way to the door. From my vantage point, I watched him climb back into his overpriced car and drive off. Later that evening, my wife offered me some ridiculous excuse about why the shelf had fallen. Something about vibrations from a passing truck or an uneven bracket she'd been meaning to fix. I listened, keeping my face neutral, nodding along as if I believed her. Her explanation was absurd, almost laughably so. But I didn't call her out. Not yet. This was only the beginning. There was more to come. Looking back, her excuse seems almost comical in its transparency. Almost. The very next day, as I'd anticipated, he came back. By now, I had developed a routine, leaving the house in the morning as if heading to work, only to double back and settle into my usual hiding spot in the backyard. Tablet in hand, I waited and watched, ready for the next move. This time, I'd done a bit more homework. From the camera feeds, I'd noticed something peculiar during their last rendezvous. She was using protection with him. Specifically, condoms she had stashed away deep inside a book tucked in her nightstand drawer. That night, after she fell asleep, I quietly checked for myself. Sure enough, there they were, neatly packed and untouched since their previous encounter. Of course, I'd anticipated this. Earlier that day, I'd gone out and purchased an identical box. But mine came with a little enhancement, a carefully added dose of pepper spray. It wasn't dangerous, but it was potent enough to ensure their next meeting would leave a lasting impression. The following morning, while my wife went out to run some errands, I seized my chance. I swapped her box with my altered one, making sure everything looked exactly as it had before. I even adjusted the bookmark in her book to its original position so she wouldn't suspect a thing. For good measure, I also added a touch of the pepper solution to her personal lubricant bottle. Attention to detail was my specialty. Later that day, as I expected, the guy showed up. I was back in my usual hiding spot, tablet in hand, watching everything unfold in real time. It all started predictably, the overly warm greetings, the awkward small talk, and then they made their way to the bedroom. Through the camera, I watched her open the drawer, grab the sabotaged box, and hand him one of the altered condoms. Everything seemed normal at first. But it didn't take long for the effects to kick in. He froze mid-motion, his face contorted in confusion and discomfort. He pulled back, wincing, while my wife looked equally bewildered. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could guess the gist of it, him muttering about irritation while she tried to reassure him that it must have been a defective product. Eventually, they decided to stop, sitting awkwardly on the edge of the bed. But their discomfort didn't end there. Thinking the condoms were the problem, they turned to the bottle of lubricant instead. I almost felt a twinge of guilt for what happened next. Almost. The moment he applied the lubricant, his reaction was instant. He bolted upright, his face a mix of agony and disbelief. He muttered curses under his breath, his hands flailing as he desperately tried to ease the burning sensation. My wife stood there, wide-eyed and horrified, trying to calm him down. Both of them stared at the bottle like it had been hexed. Eventually, they gave up entirely. They sat side by side on the bed, defeated, their plans for the day in complete disarray. After a while, he gathered his clothes, muttering something about pharmacies selling defective products before storming out the door. I sat in my spot, struggling to hold back laughter as I watched the scene unfold. The absurdity of it all was like something out of a dark comedy. Their faces, their frustration, it was priceless. The cherry on top was hearing them both agree that the pharmacy must have been at fault. With that phase of my plan complete, I set my sights on something a bit more potent. After some research, I settled on skunk essence. Turns out, you can find just about anything online if you know where to look. Within days, a small bottle of the most vile-smelling liquid imaginable arrived at my doorstep. Handling it required extreme care. Even a few drops of the stuff could stink up an entire room for days. My plan was simple but effective. I rigged a mason jar with a remote-controlled lid. Inside the jar, I carefully poured the skunk essence, making sure not to spill a single drop. Once the lid popped open, the smell would hit them like a freight train, and there'd be no escape. I hid the jar beneath our bed, positioning it so it was well concealed but perfectly placed to do its job. As expected, the guy returned. I had the cameras rolling and was back in my usual spot in the backyard, tablet in hand. This time, they wasted no time. They headed straight to the bedroom, clearly eager to make up for their previous failed encounters. I watched as they sat down on the bed, exchanging hushed words, their expressions full of anticipation. The moment he leaned in closer to her, I pressed the button. With a faint click, the lid beneath the bed popped open, releasing the skunk essence into the room. It didn't take long for the smell to start spreading. At first, they just looked confused. My wife wrinkled her nose, glancing around, while the guy froze mid-motion, his face contorting in pure disgust. And then the full force of it hit them. Both of them shot up from the bed, gagging and covering their faces. My wife stumbled toward the door, dry heaving as she went, while he flailed his arms uselessly, as if he could somehow push the stench away. The chaos was glorious. They tried everything, opening windows, fanning the air, but it was already too late. The smell had seeped into the curtains, the bedding, and probably even their clothes and hair. Watching it all unfold through the cameras, I had to bite down on my knuckles to keep from laughing out loud. My wife was frantic, shouting at him, demanding to know if he'd spilled something or brought something into the house. He, meanwhile, was too busy choking and gagging to form a coherent response. Finally, they gave up and abandoned the bedroom altogether, retreating to the living room where the air was at least breathable. Later, I overheard her on the phone, probably venting to her friend. She was ranting about how the smell must have been caused by something in the plumbing or the sewage pipes. It just came out of nowhere, she kept saying, her voice rising in frustration. It has to be the pipes. She had no idea. She couldn't know. And as I watched her scramble for answers, grasping at straws, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. After the skunk essence debacle, I started noticing a new pattern. The guy began bringing alcohol with him every time he came over: wine, whiskey, even champagne. It was clear he was trying to set a more romantic mood, probably hoping to salvage whatever chemistry they thought they had left. I watched through the cameras as they poured drinks, laughed awkwardly, and tried to rekindle their connection. And that's when I got another idea. I went out and bought a bottle of industrial-strength liquid laxative. It was clear, odorless, and undetectable when mixed with liquids, perfect for what I had in mind. The key was to make sure it wouldn't stand out. One afternoon, while my wife was out running errands, I got to work. I took every wine glass, champagne flute, and tumbler from the bar cabinet and carefully added a few drops of the laxative to each one. I measured it just right, not enough to be obvious, but just enough to guarantee an uncomfortable surprise. That evening, when the guy arrived, I was ready. I settled into my usual spot in the backyard, tablet in hand, and watched as they made themselves comfortable. Through the cameras, I saw them pouring drinks, her with wine, him with whiskey. They clinked their glasses, shared a knowing smile, and took a sip. I almost wanted to set a timer to count down the minutes until it hit them. At first, everything seemed normal. They sat close together on the couch, whispering and laughing softly. But soon, I noticed my wife shifting uncomfortably. Her smile faltered, and she excused herself, stepping away briefly. Almost at the same time, the guy froze mid-sentence. His face twitched, his expression turning into a mix of confusion and dread, like he was processing some internal disaster. And then it hit them. Both of them stood up abruptly, their movements jerky and panicked. My wife bolted toward the bathroom, and he wasn't far behind, muttering something under his breath as he clutched his stomach. What followed was pure chaos. Their argument started soft but tense, the kind where neither wanted to admit the obvious. They both desperately needed the bathroom, and neither could wait much longer. My wife made the first move, dashing toward the downstairs bathroom, while he bolted upstairs. I could barely contain my laughter as I switched between the camera feeds, one showing her pacing in the hallway, the other showing him banging on the locked bathroom door in frustration. After what felt like an eternity, they finally emerged. Both looked pale, flushed, and thoroughly embarrassed. My wife plopped down on the couch, clutching her stomach, while he lingered awkwardly near the front door. They exchanged a few words, trying to rationalize the chaos. I caught snippets of their conversation, blaming the wine, the whiskey, and even joking weakly about food poisoning. But then, the tone shifted. They started throwing around phrases like, "It feels like a curse and bad luck." They wondered aloud if someone, or something, was actively working against them. It was fascinating to watch as their thoughts spiraled into paranoia. Eventually, they decided to call it a night. The guy grabbed his coat, muttering about needing to rest, and left. My wife sat there on the couch for a while, still clutching her stomach and looking lost in thought. As I watched them part ways, I couldn't help but smirk. Once again, their little rendezvous had gone spectacularly off the rails, and they were none the wiser. After the chaos of the previous traps, I decided it was time to try something more mechanical, a classic sabotage. I had plenty of experience with woodworking and structural design, so tampering with the bed frame was well within my skill set. Late one night, after my wife had fallen asleep, I grabbed my tools and crept into the bedroom. Carefully, I weakened the joints of the bed frame, sawing just enough at key points to ensure it would hold, until the right amount of pressure made it collapse. It wouldn't be immediately obvious, but at the height of their little moment, it would give way in spectacular fashion. The hardest part was waiting. I kept up my usual routine, leaving the house as if heading to work, then circling back to my usual hiding spot in the backyard with my tablet. The cameras were rolling, and I was ready. Right on schedule, he arrived. Same smug grin, same overconfident swagger as he walked through the front door. My wife greeted him warmly, and before long, they were heading upstairs to the bedroom. My pulse quickened, but I stayed focused on the screen. Everything unfolded just as I'd expected. They climbed onto the bed, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But then came the first creak, a sharp, strained sound that cut through the air. They froze, exchanging uncertain glances, but then shrugged it off and continued. That was their mistake. With one final, loud crack, the bed frame gave out entirely. The mattress dropped, and the two of them tumbled into the splintered wood below. The guy let out a panicked yell, while my wife shrieked in frustration. I watched as they scrambled to untangle themselves from the mess of blankets, pillows, and broken wood. The camera feed didn't do justice to my wife's expression, pure rage mixed with humiliation. For a long moment, they just sat there, defeated, covered in sweat and dust. My wife eventually stood up, rubbing her shoulder and glaring at the wreckage, while the guy looked utterly mortified. After some hushed discussion, they attempted a clumsy fix, propping the broken frame back up with duct tape and mismatched screws. It was a half-hearted effort at best. They didn't stay much longer after that. The guy left, clearly irritated, while my wife spent the rest of the evening tinkering with the bed frame, trying, and failing, to restore some stability, but no matter how hard she worked, the damage was done. That bed was never going to be the same again. As she tinkered with her amateur repair job, I sat quietly in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone. She thought she'd hidden the evidence well enough, that she'd covered her tracks. But she was wrong. I knew everything. The final phase of my plan required precision, patience, and just the right amount of theatrical flair. By now, the guy was clearly on edge. The string of bizarre accidents had taken its toll on his confidence, but his stubborn persistence kept bringing him back. That, I decided, would be his downfall. For this finale, I set up 2 final traps, each crafted with meticulous care. The first was simple yet devastatingly effective. I rigged a carabiner clip with a remote trigger and attached it to the chandelier in our bedroom. With a single press of a button on my phone, the carabiner would release, sending the chandelier crashing down onto the bed below. It wasn't designed to hurt anyone, just to create enough chaos to send him running for good. As a backup, I prepared my piece de resistance, a modified bear trap hidden under the mattress. Its sharp teeth had been carefully filed down to prevent serious injury, but it was still capable of delivering enough pain to make its point. To add one final touch, I tampered with the bedroom door handle. I embedded small conductive strips into the metal, wiring them to a concealed battery pack and connecting it to a remote trigger. Once activated, the handle would deliver a sharp electric shock, not dangerous, but enough to make anyone think twice about their choices. The stage was set. I waited patiently in my usual spot in the backyard, tablet in hand, my eyes glued to the camera feeds. Sure enough, right on schedule, the guy showed up again. My wife greeted him at the door, though her nervous expression told me she could sense his hesitation. Together, they headed upstairs. I could see him glancing around nervously, as if expecting disaster to strike at any moment. He wasn't wrong. The moment they settled on the bed, I pressed the first button. The chandelier came crashing down, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces across the mattress. It missed him by inches, but the effect was instantaneous. He bolted upright, his eyes wide with panic, while my wife screamed. For a brief moment, they were both frozen, unsure of what to do. And then he made his next mistake. As he scrambled to get off the bed, he stepped right into the trap. The modified bear trap snapped shut around his leg, not hard enough to break anything, but more than enough to cause a painful shock. He let out a strangled yell, clutching at his thigh in agony. My wife was in full-blown panic mode now, tugging at the trap, trying to free him. Eventually, they managed to get him loose. Limping and cursing, he stumbled toward the door. But I wasn't done. The moment his hand wrapped around the doorknob, I pressed the second button. The electric charge jolted through him, sending him stumbling backward with his hair standing on end. He let out a string of colorful curses loud enough to echo through the walls. And that's when I made my entrance. I walked into the room calmly, fists clenched, my expression cold. Without a word, I delivered 2 well-placed punches to his face, sending him reeling. He stumbled back, barely able to stand, as I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him out the front door. I watched as he staggered down the driveway, clutching his face, and climbed into his car. My wife stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to speak, an apology, an excuse. I didn't care. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply pointed to the door and told her to leave. Her shoulders sagged as she nodded, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed a few belongings, then walked out with her head hanging low. And just like that, it was over. The house was quiet again, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. My plan had worked. But I wasn't quite finished yet. That I gathered all the footage from the cameras, every awkward encounter, every humiliating failure, every trap that had derailed their little rendezvous. I edited it into a series of videos and uploaded them anonymously to YouTube under the title Karma Chronicles, The Cheating Saga. The videos took off almost overnight. People laughed, shared, and commented on the videos non-stop. The internet had a field day with it, and the reactions poured in faster than I could keep up. But the most satisfying part wasn't just the public response, it was sharing the link directly with our mutual friends, her family, and even a few of her co-workers. The fallout was swift and brutal. My wife's carefully constructed image of innocence shattered almost instantly. Friends distanced themselves, some cutting ties completely. Her family expressed their disappointment in her choices, and as for the guy she'd risked everything for, he vanished. He wanted no part of the viral disaster our story had become. When the divorce proceedings began, she tried to play the victim card, throwing out claims of emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and whatever else she could come up with. But my lawyer, who I'd specifically chosen for his cold, methodical approach, systematically dismantled every argument she made. The evidence was undeniable. Every lie she attempted to spin was countered with hard, recorded facts. Video footage doesn't lie, and the judge saw right through her performance. She tried to paint herself as a victim, but the truth was painfully clear. In the end, the divorce settlement heavily favored me. I kept the house, most of our shared assets, and even the car. She walked away with little more than a suitcase and whatever was left of her dignity, which, honestly, wasn't much by then. Her life spiraled after that. She struggled to hold down a job, and I wasn't surprised. Her name was forever tied to the infamous YouTube videos, and it seemed like every workplace she applied to had at least one person who had seen them. The guy she'd thrown everything away for? He never spoke to her again. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, she ended up renting a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a low-paying office job. Her once busy social life evaporated, and she became a ghost on social media. As for me, life turned a corner. I focused on my work, throwing myself into new projects with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I rediscovered hobbies I'd long neglected and enjoyed the peace and quiet of my home. No more paranoia, no more hidden cameras, just freedom. Friends who stood by me offered their support, and slowly, I rebuilt. A year later, I met someone new. Someone genuine. Someone who appreciated me for who I was. This time, I took things slow, allowing trust to grow naturally. Step by step, I found myself opening up again. Meanwhile, the Karma Chronicles series continued to circulate online, popping up in internet discussions every now and then. Occasionally, strangers would reach out, calling me a hero, a genius, or someone with an impeccable sense of justice. It was surreal, but in the end, justice hadn't just been served, it had been documented, shared, and immortalized online. My ex-wife became a cautionary tale, a living reminder of what happens when you take someone for granted. Sometimes, curiosity would get the better of me, and I'd check her social media, only to find nothing. She'd gone completely silent. And honestly, that suited me just fine. I closed that chapter of my life with satisfaction. The house was quiet, peaceful, and finally mine.